Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David Ige.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Well, aloha and good morning. It is 10:30 here on this Monday morning. Great to see so many of you already logging in and starting your week off with us. I'm Ryan Kalei Suji, joined by Yanji Denise, and this, of course, is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. This morning, Yanji, we are spotlighting the political season that we find ourselves in. It has been a crazy season thus far as we head down into the final few months before the primary election. And this morning, I'm going to be speaking to two people who know a little bit about politics here in Hawaii.
Just a touch. We are talking to powerhouse political analysts Neal Milner and Colin Moore. Of course, many of you are familiar with their work. They are always the go-to folks when it comes to election season. Tomorrow is the filing deadline for Hawaii candidates for the August 13th primary. Colin, I want to start with you. What are you anticipating for tomorrow and for the months ahead? Because it seems like, we didn't even know where to start. We have so many races to talk about.
We have a ton of races to talk about, a crowded governor's race, a crowded Republican primary, which is sometimes rare, many candidates in the LG's race, 4 pretty strong candidates. Every House and Senate district is up for election, although some of those are more competitive than others that we'll talk about. Several mayoral races, districts here in the city council. There's just a ton of races to cover, and I know we'll just scratch the surface today, but a lot of interesting things going on, particularly coming on the heels of reapportionment.
Yeah, Neal, if we can talk a little bit about reapportionment and how that has impacted the political landscape this election year and some of the things that we're seeing as an effect of this reapportionment.
Well, the effect of reapportionment depends on how the votes turn out. But let's start one of the things that's...
Unfortunately, it sounds like we're having some audio issues all of a sudden with Neal. Let's see if we can try that again. Let's see here. Neal, if you can hear us?
I can hear you.
Yeah. It sounds like we're having some issues here.
Does that work?
There we go.
Yeah,
there we go. That's better.
Oh, all right. As I was saying, or at least to myself, the one of the limiting effects of reapportionment here, there are really two. One of which is that the reapportionment here is fairly straightforward and not as biased as it may be in other places because of the way we do it. The second thing is that in a state that's heavily Democratic, almost district by district, if you're talking about the state legislature, the likelihood that it's going to change the party distribution very much is not likely to be the case. So that's the limit. So you have a few districts where incumbents might be thrown together and a few districts where the dynamic is a little bit different. But I don't think that reapportionment here is going to have a significant factor on the election for the same reason that a lot of other things don't have the effect on the election. And that is, this is a tremendously strong one-party state, and that limits the ultimate effect of reapportionment by saying if you have 47 members of the Democratic Party now are in the legislature and 4 Republicans, that's not going to change much because of reapportionment.
Colin, building on that, one of the races in the last election cycle that may have caught some by surprise was Speaker Saiki's seat, and just how close Kim Koko Iwamoto came to unseating him in his district. He's the speaker, so you would think that he would have a pretty solid ground. What are you expecting for that race in particular when we look at the ledge?
I mean, you're absolutely right. That was one of the closest races. It was 167 votes that the speaker won. I think it's going to be very close again. I mean, that Kaka'ako district can be hard to predict because there's a lot of new people who've moved in there who might not be familiar with Speaker Saiki. Kim Koko Iwamoto always runs a really strong campaign. She has a lot of money behind her campaign. So it's going to be competitive again. How competitive we'll have to see. Speaker Saiki, I think, did pass a lot of progressive legislation this cycle. And one of the things that's interesting to me about this race that makes it so unusual is it's a highly ideological race compared to most legislative races we see in this state. Kim Koko has clearly positioned herself as a progressive, against Scott Saiki, more of the mainstream Democratic Party leader. So you see those ideological tensions in a way that you rarely see them in most legislative races.
And when you're looking at a race like that close margin, another race that was close during the last election cycle was that of a Maui district with Linda Coit as well as Walter Riddy, a Hawaiian activist. His name has been around for some time. That was another close race. What are some of the determining factors you think when a race is that close, how a candidate is able to separate themselves going into a rematch like this?
Well, if it's that close, you may not have to separate yourself that much. But I think the first thing to remember is how well known both of these candidates really are by now, and how it may not be. It certainly isn't the kind of ideological issue that Colin just talked about. But there's another factor here that's really a wild card because of what happened in the past election. Despite what Colin and I said about how turnout tends to work, there was a huge increase in turnout in Hawaii, voter turnout in Hawaii. And we don't know how much of that is a one-off or maybe a two-off if you count the primary and the general election. But that can be a factor in any of these things, that it may have to do with which candidate, especially in a close race, which candidate can mobilize people to get out and vote.
Let's talk about that too, Colin. This is the second election where we're having mail-in voting. Every voter gets a ballot delivered to their house. How do you think that will change participation and some of the trends that Neal was just talking about?
Well, I think it's unlikely we're going to have, the extraordinary rate of participation we saw during the last primary, because that was a presidential year, and midterm election years are always a little bit lower. But there are a lot of important races. And we saw, as you mentioned, such a huge increase in in turnout as a result in part of this switch to mail-in voting. Hawaii, showed the biggest difference than any other state in the nation in terms of how our turnout increased after we went to mail-in voting. So I suspect it's going to be still relatively high, at least compared to before mail-in, because one thing that happens when people vote for that first time is they tend to remain voters. They've already done it once. They know how it works. And I expect that people will see that ballot on their table. That'll generate some family conversations, and they'll turn it in. So again, probably not as high as we saw last time because it's not a presidential year, but I suspect it'll still be higher than we've seen in the last few election cycles prior to going to mail-in.
Yeah, I just want to add that in some other states, there was a peak when they went to mail-in or an easier way to vote, and then it leveled off a little bit. It dropped and it leveled off a little bit. But I think, Colin, you're definitely right that whatever it looks like, it's going to be bigger than what we're used to here, but not as big as it was the last time.
Colin, one of the races or a number of seats that are open are that of the city council. If you can maybe just talk to some of the names that we're seeing of people who have pulled papers and some who have filed. What do you think the makeup of the council will look like and some of these races as we move forward?
Well, sure. So maybe I can just go through a few of them. District 2, this is Heidi Suniyoshi's district, who tends to be more conservative. Of course, she's running for the Republican primary for governor. We have two candidates there, Makua Rothman, well-known big wave surfer. Matt Wire, who's running more of a traditional candidate. He comes from a more city lawyer, administrative background. Hard to know how that one's going to shape up. District 4, Tommy Waters is going to run. Likely he's going to win. He's quite popular. District 6 is an interesting race. Tyler Dos Santos Tam, the head of the Democratic Party, against Kaika Hussey. In some ways, this is a rematch from a race when they both ran against Carol Fukunaga. And that race actually, Kaika Hussey was a little bit ahead of Tyler Dos Santos Tam. Again, hard to say. These are both progressive candidates. Who's going to come out on top? That probably won't change the makeup of the council. And then finally, and in my mind, one of the most interesting council races is District 8. This is Ron Minor against Val Okimoto. Ron Minor running, again, who has served on council before. against Val Okamoto, who was a Republican member of the state House. If she wins, that likely will shift the council maybe a little bit to the more conservative side. You know, one thing that's always so interesting about the council and nonpartisan races in Hawaii overall are that more conservative candidates and Republicans tend to do okay in those races. We have a lot of more conservative, even Republicans on the city council right now.
So interesting to see how that will all shake up. I want to go to the lieutenant governor's race, Neal, and get your thoughts on that. This is an office that is so interesting because it's really what the person makes of it, who's in that office. We've seen Josh Green make that a pretty strong office. If you look at all his input when it comes to safe travels and the vaccine rollout and just, you know, all the things we've seen with him and how much he's also distinguished himself from the governor himself. What do you think about the folks who are running for lieutenant governor right now? And who do you think has the edge?
Well, there are two things about the ones running for lieutenant governor right now. They're all highly competent people with a good deal of public service. Some, the public service is not as an elected politician, and they make it a point. That's McNamara and Amamiya, and they make it a point to say that makes us better because we're not like politicians. But they're all public servants, and they all have been around politics. There's certainly the Chamber of Commerce that McNamara is involved with, and some of the stuff that Amamiya. The second thing, though, is that it's fundamentally hard to figure out who has the edge here. The easy argument is that Sylvia Luke has the edge because she probably has greater name recognition, and because in the legislature this time she was very visible and was very good at giving out money where she thought it should be given out and making kind of strong Sylvia Luke-like budgetary statements when she wanted to go that way. But I don't think at this stage, we don't have any better information. I don't. Colin can speak for himself. I don't have any better information on how the candidates are doing relative to each other. I'll just add one thing. The idea that you don't really have regular duties, which is pretty close, gives the candidates an opportunity to fantasize. That is to say, this is what we do, this is how we'll fill it. And that's a nice thing to do. But again, that's really not under their control. And we've had governors that have pretty much just iced out the lieutenant governors. And we've had some, John Waihee, for example, that got Ben Cayetano a great deal of visibility because he had some highly visible projects that Cayetano did very well.
Colin, your thoughts about the LG race and where we stand with these four major contenders on the Democratic side and who you see maybe stepping ahead?
Well, I agree that the conventional wisdom now is that Sylvia Luke is ahead. I'm not sure I actually buy that. She does have a lot of endorsements, a lot of money, but she also started from relatively little name recognition just compared to some of the competitors. Jill Takuta left this race, so there's a question about who benefited from her exit of this race. And I think that Keith Amamiya and Ikaika Anderson have been running very strong campaigns. So at this point, I think it's impossible to predict whether it's Luke, Amamiya, or Anderson. I do think that Sherry Minor McNamara is likely in fourth place. That's not because she's ran a bad campaign. It's because she's trying to do something extremely difficult. Come out from outside of politics with a business-oriented background, which she's emphasized, and win in a Democratic primary. Remember, this isn't a nonpartisan race where we've seen more conservative candidates do well. This is a Democratic primary where only Democratic voters are going to participate. So I think that's likely going to be a struggle for her. But of the top three, I think it's impossible to predict. It's going to be a squeaker.
Let me just add something real briefly to what Colin said, that people always talk about wanting to elect a new face, refreshing politician, a non-politician, someone who has business experience, except that they seldom get the votes to win. There are all kinds of reasons for that. But these candidates like McNamara and to some extent Amamiya are running on the fresh face argument. And the fresh face argument sounds good on paper, and lots of people say it's okay. We would like to see a fresh face to get rid of those corrupt politicians, except the fresh faces become less fresh faces and lose.
You know, Colin, we talk about Sylvia Luke also in terms of just how much money she has. How expensive and competitive do you think this lieutenant governor's race will be, given that it is for something with, I mean, I like the way Neal put it, a job that you kind of fantasize of what you can do, but who knows what you actually get to do once you get there? Well,
it's going to be expensive. I mean, you know, well over $500,000 for, I think, competitive candidates. You know, the interesting thing about this, so if you look at what happened last time we ran this race when Josh Green won, one of the big players was an independent expenditure group, the Be Change Now Carpenters PAC. I haven't seen them endorse a candidate or be particularly active. So that outside money that I think really made the difference in the last race, which was against Green and Takuda, where people forget Green didn't win by all that much. What made the difference was these independent expenditure groups. I don't know if you're going to see that this time, so it's going to be the candidates left to spend the money they've raised. But certainly Luke has a lot of money. Kaika has done well in part because he had a lot of money coming into this race from money he raised when he was city council chair. I think Amamiya struggled a little more with that, but he's benefited from being the last candidate who really ran a big race when he ran for mayor. And so he has a lot of that lingering name recognition. And that's what money really gets you. At the end of the day, money buys name recognition to pay for those big TV ads.
Ryan, you're muted.
Got it. Okay, sorry, we're running into some issues here today. Neal, talk a little bit about Jill Takuda, and her pulling out of this race obviously means a opportunity for her to enter the CD2 race. Your thoughts about where we're at with CD2 and these two candidates, front-running candidates in Pat Bronco and Jill Takuda. And Neal, you're actually muted now.
If you're Jill Takuda and you had dreams about a career in politics that came outside of the legislature, in some ways your morning was good and your dreams came true, because all of a sudden a seat in Congress that we thought was a lock for a candidate, the incumbent for a long time, not only came open, but for the most part, strong candidates, name recognition candidates, disappeared by the wayside. So Jill Takuda has gone from someone who's certainly thought about running for this kind of office and did a little bit, to a position of a lot of strength. I don't think the competition in the Democratic primary is all that strong. The other candidate who's in there is actually a pretty good candidate, but he's not very well known.
Yeah, your thoughts on that, Colin?
I totally agree with Neal. This is a remarkable stroke of luck for Jill Takuda. I mean, she was running for LG. She was competitive, but I think struggling a little bit. And then this moment of opportunity was created, and she seized on it. And now she's clearly the leading candidate in this race. I agree with Neal that Patrick Bronco is a high-quality candidate, but again, doesn't have the name recognition and probably not enough time or money to make up the difference. Jill Takuda was potentially going to face off against some very strong competitors: Jarrett Keohokalole, senator from the Windward side, Angus McKelvey, another state senator. Even Tommy Waters gave it a very serious look. And for a variety of reasons, mainly strategic, all of these candidates decided either to stay in their office, run for a slightly different office. But Takuda had the advantage because she was the first one to declare her candidacy. So all of a sudden, the conversation with all of these other potential candidates became, can I beat Jill Takuda? Can I raise that money? And I think they decided it wasn't necessarily worth the risk. So it's a shocking thing in some ways that a congressional seat in Hawaii that comes up so rarely, it looks like Jill Takuda is going to be a very, very competitive candidate. Unless something drastically changes with Patrick Bronco's campaign, she's very likely to win.
And Neal, that naturally brings us, of course, to the Democratic primary for governor. You have Kai Kahele entering the race late and taking this public money option, not taking any PAC money. Obviously, that's a strategic decision as well, because he entered so late, and raising money at that point is probably pretty tough. Tell us about how you're looking at the Democrats running for governor right now.
Well, I mean, you start with the fact that there's no reason to believe that Josh Green isn't still the heavy favorite. He had, unless something dramatically bad happened, and I don't think it did, he's had high approval ratings. He has lots of money, and he was leading the candidates by a pretty good margin earlier on, even before Caldwell dropped out. But by that time, Caldwell was pretty minor. So that seems to be, it's certainly not a lock, But if you go by conventional ways of looking at elections, he's really in a strong situation. Vicky Cayetano is somewhat different because she's running as an outsider, in a sense, talking about being business-like and so on, not being one of those politicians. But yet all of a sudden, there are these negative ads that she's producing. Not, well, it's a PAC, but clearly her supporters are producing. The real person that is hard to evaluate is Kai Kahele, because everything I just said about Josh Green is the opposite for Kai Kahele. There doesn't seem to be anything in his immediate narrative that is all the stuff that we heard about why he gave up Congress and all, and this, working from home and all that stuff. There's nothing in there that makes him a strong candidate. But there's something today that was a reminder, a piece in Civil Beat by Kevin Bacon, that talks about Kahele in a way that's rather different. He's looking at it in terms of Hawaiian voters and Hawaiian support. It's not directly on this point, but one of the things that reminds you of is that there is a different narrative here that Kahele is going to try to exploit that keeps away from this kind of bad stuff that he was involved in. I think it's still very, very hard to do this. Yeah, I had a laugh when he gave up money from PACs and when he said, I'm not taking any big donations, because as Yunji said, yeah, you give them up when you're not going to get them. And that pretty much is the situation he was in.
And Colin, when you look at this race with someone like Josh Green that is so far ahead in many of the polls and fundraising efforts, what do you think the path is for candidates like Vicky Cayetano and Kai Kahele to make up some of that ground? What would a victory path look like for either one of them?
Well, the first thing it would involve is a whole lot of money. To run for governor for a statewide race against a candidate who's ahead, who people tend to like, who has tremendous name recognition, you've got to have that money to explain to people, which is the second thing, why they should vote for you and not the leading candidate. You've really got to make that move. It's not enough just to say that you're a good candidate and people should consider you. I think a lot of people think that Vicky Cayetano they respect her. They think she ran a great business and they like her, but she would have to explain, well, why, vote for me and not Green for this reason. And I think Kahele is going to struggle with the same thing. Remember, he and Green were both Big Island senators. To some degree, they're competing for some similar votes, although Green has a whole lot of votes that Kahele doesn't. And so you've got to craft that narrative about why I would be a better governor than the leading candidate. And I don't think either of them have quite managed to do that, although I think Kahele has gone much farther than doing that by trying to represent himself as a populist. I mean, clearly his populist campaign saying he's not going to take a lot of money, that is, a not so indirect attack on Green. So he's done a little bit of that, but it's extremely hard to make up the amount of, to come back from where they are. I mean, I expect that Green is probably polling in the 50s now, and I think Cayetano and Kahele are probably down in the 20s. Maybe if they had more time. There's only 2 months left in this election, and they don't have the kind of money it would take to really get that message across were they to develop it. So I think it's becoming harder and harder to see a path for victory. But I agree that for many people, Kahele is a very attractive candidate. He does seem to strike an emotional chord with voters in a way that the other two candidates do not. I do think that his supporters are extremely committed. I just think it's likely to be the case that there aren't enough of them because people formed in their mind this very positive impression of the lieutenant governor because of his work during COVID. And so once voters have formed that impression, it's really hard to shake it. And it would take a lot of money to do that. And I don't think the other two candidates have that kind of money.
Interesting. Well, of course, we're talking about the primary, and that means there are Republicans running for the governor's seat as well. And there is a Republican primary for governor as well. So, Neal, what are your thoughts on BJ Penn, Heidi Tsuneyoshi, and then, of course, we have Lynn Mariano and Paul Morgan, some other folks running for governor right now on the Republican side?
Well, if you read some of the material on Paul Morgan, I mean, first of all, 2 of those 4 are simply not well known at all, and that's a real handicap. Competence aside, Mariano and Paul Morgan are not very well known at all. If you look at their stuff, they tend to sound like Republicans used to sound. That is, they're good government, anti-corruption, lower taxes, that kind of stuff. The other 2 candidates are a little bit different because in their own way they have visibility, but different kind of visibility. Heidi Kuniyoshi has been an up-and-comer for a while, and she's done a respectable job in the legislature, and she's clearly a Republican. And so I guess if you want to look at those 3, she has more of a name recognition. BJ Penn is BJ Penn. I don't know what to say about it. I would be much more confident in talking about a candidate like BJ Penn in a skeptical manner if we haven't been living with Donald Trump in the aftermath for a long period of time. I'm not saying that BJ Penn identifies with Donald Trump. I am saying that that kind of highly emotional politics that he's talking about, a highly confident kind of, I can do anything I want to bring about change. So he's clearly an outlier. I guess we don't really have a poll on this. We really don't have much of a sense. I think Heidi Kuniyoshi will do pretty well. Those other candidates, let's put it this way. The Republican Party should keep their eye on all of the other candidates in this race for very different reasons, because for very different ways they might become stronger candidates later. And that includes, in this day and age, BJ Penn.
And Colin, how about for you, your thoughts about this race, and also a familiar name that is also pulled paper but has not yet filed?
That's right. So Duke Iona, of course, the former lieutenant governor, pulled papers and hasn't filed. That might shake things up a little bit. I mean, I agree with everything that Neal just said. I think that BJ Penn's celebrity is just going to give him an enormous advantage. I mean, you see BJ Penn signs around town. I think that people are very excited by his candidacy. Again, a very populist kind of angry candidacy. He's really running against the state and what he sees as its failures, particularly in COVID, but in a variety of other areas. I think that, Heidi Kuniyoshi and Duke Iona, if he does decide to run, are much more mainstream candidates. They may actually, if they both run, they may actually split that mainstream Republican vote, and that would help BJ Penn. I'll say this now, it would not surprise me at all if BJ Penn became the Republican nominee for governor. It might be a good thing. It might generate a lot of interesting conversations moving into the general election. I think he could be a very good candidate. I think with a little more work on his communication style. And I think he'll likely be back, even if he doesn't win this time. He may very well run again for another race.
We're almost out of time, but I'd love to get some closing thoughts from both of you just on what we're expecting. We talked a little bit about voter participation, but how engaged do you think the community is? We've been so distracted with our own issues when it comes to COVID mitigation and the economy and just making sure our kids can go to school. When you look at voters and their interest and engagement in this election, how do you see that, and what do you anticipate for not just the participation, but just people really paying attention to all of the races that we outlined, and there are even more depending on where they live. Neal, we'll start with you.
Well, the first thing that makes it hard to talk about voter engagement is that the media here doesn't do a great job in writing about voter engagement, so that it is hard really to get a sense from day to day how engaged the Hawaii voters are. I would say that the question is, and I'm hedging my bets here, it's a little bit up in the air, because you have decent candidates, not necessarily compelling candidates. You have interesting races, but I'm not sure how really interesting they are. We always assume that voters are more engaged than they turn out to be. There's this whole question about name recognition, for example. I'm not even sure at this stage how many of these candidates voters recognize their name. So it's a short time before the election. We might have a better sense of engagement by now. I would basically say it's an open question with a little bit of a tailwind pushing voter turnout ahead. But I don't think the candidates have done a great job in engaging the voters. It's not an easy job to do, but I still find the pattern sort of, dull and stultifying.
And Colin, for you, a final word on where we're at.
I agree. It's not as a result of anything the candidates have done that voters will be engaged. It's because people already voted during the last election. Those mail-in ballots are going to come, and because they're sitting there in their dining room table, they're likely to participate. It's not because they're charged up about this election. I think it's just going to be through our mail-in voting process. They're going to see them, and they're likely going to participate that way, although certainly not at the level you saw in the last presidential election 2 years ago.
So interesting to hear from you both, Colin Moore and Neal Milner, political analysts, powerhouses, as we call them off the top. We appreciate your analysis today, and we'll love to have you back probably after the primary so we can see the aftermath of all of the races that we talked about and going into the general. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks.
Aloha.
Well, Ryan, we touched on so many races, and really, I mean, we could spend hours talking about, the ledge and redistricting and reapportionment. We talked a little bit about some of the races to watch there. Also, of course, city council, lieutenant governor, CD2, and the race for governor. So much to think about as we head into the filing deadline, which is tomorrow.
Yeah, and we should have, of course, a clear picture at that point in time of those candidates who are officially running and who have got through that process and making that filing deadline and seeing how things shake up. We often have heard in the past that when there are this many races and this many candidates out there, it can come as a shock to some voters out there because of the number of options, getting confused between which candidate is belonging to which seat. And so we're going to have to just see how things play out as we head into these final months, and the narrative becomes a little more clear for some of these candidates of how they are going to get their views and their thoughts and their ideas for Hawaii moving forward in each of their own campaigns. So we will continue to stay posted. And on Wednesday, we're going to be speaking to one of those candidates.
That's right. Sylvia Luke, who you heard talked about at length today in her race for lieutenant governor. She, of course, is leaving the legislature after many years. She has a significant war chest, and both Milner and Moore both said that they consider her a possible front runner for the race for LG. There's not really any polling data that they're looking at, but they're looking at war chest and name recognition. They said that she has somewhat of an uphill battle because she's really Oahu centric, and that, of course, is a statewide race. So we'll be talking to her about how the campaign is going and what her pitch is to voters as she tries to distinguish herself in a pretty crowded field.
Yeah, look forward to that conversation. Thank you for being a part of today's conversation. We'll see you right back here on Wednesday for another episode of Spotlight Hawaii. Aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.